Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got a really interesting author to introduce you tonight. Her name is Julie Salverson. Her book is A Necessary Distance, Confessions of a Screenwriter's Daughter. Sounds really fascinating. I understand that your father, George Salverson, has written over 1,000 radio plays for the CBC before he became the first television drama editor for the corporation. Welcome to the show, Julie.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Tell me what motivated you to write this book.
Well, kind of an accident, as often happens. My dad died in 2000, and probably like a lot of people, I was anxious and nervous about looking through his stuff. So for about 5 years or so, and there were a lot of things, or maybe 6 or 7 boxes, that was it. So one day a friend of mine said, I'm coming over with some magic markers and some newspaper, we're gonna do it together. So when I was looking for them, I was actually interested in the record of a documentary he'd made in the late 60s called Air of Death, which was a great big story for the CBC because it's a story for another time, although it's in the book. Anyway, it was the first time the words air pollution were ever used. And the CBC ended up being sued by a big corporation in America. And it was something he was very proud of. So I was looking for that. And when I found it, I also stumbled upon 7 little notebooks, handwritten notebooks that turned out to be his personal account of a tour he took in 1963. He went around the world to over 20 countries, and he did a documentary on world hunger. So I didn't know about this, even though I was 7 at the time. I didn't know about it. He never talked about it later with me. And my husband said, because I had written a book before that was about the story of atomic history from northern Canada to New Mexico to Japan, and it was kind of a travel memoir that was a combination of my personal exploration of my obsession with nuclear war, frankly, and also the story of Canada's connection to the atomic bomb. So Bill said, well, this is your next trip. Here's this trip that your dad took. And I thought, oh my God. So it was finding the notebooks and thinking, what could I do with them? So that was the impetus to get me started. Yeah.
And these notebooks, you say in the foreword to the book that they weren't the father you knew.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I bet most of us, there's something of a father we don't know, right? So that's kind of a universal experience, I think. He was in his mid-40s. He'd never been outside of North America. And on the one hand, he's speaking privately to himself. It's not his notes about the show, about the documentary, really. It's what he's experiencing. So I had to confront all kinds of assumptions that my dad had that he was willing to confront himself. So, he talks about brown people, and then he talks about how relieved he is to get to India because they speak English and it's organized in a way he understands. And at first, not just at first, I'd say the first couple of years of me reading this, I was framed by the moment that I live in right now. So here I am, a white woman in Canada, looking at, white privilege and all these histories and colonialism. And I was really afraid, what will people think of my father? And I think that the journey that I took was to remember and to realize that all of us hold so many different parts of ourselves, and that I don't think my father was ever really a villain or a racist, but he had assumptions. And what's exciting to me about him is he was so honest in his being appalled at some of the things he was experiencing and thinking. So I felt like I found out that he was a more courageous person than I knew. In a sense, I always knew he had integrity, but I felt like he had more integrity. And it took me the whole writing of the book to stop judging him and realize that, like all of us, he has blind spots and he's framed by his times. And then the other thing is that there were some other notebooks I found that had notes about the family. My mom was an actress, and she was quite dramatic and drank a lot, and him talking about that. And maybe the other thing that I knew but didn't know so hugely was in his private notebooks, other than this journey of the trip, every other page is a budget. every other page is a budget. And I thought, okay, this is a writer in Canada. Even a writer who's working all the time, he's still thinking every month, how do I pay the bills? And so that was another revelation.
Did you learn something about your mother through these books?
You know how I learned about my mother? I learned about my mother because I had to confront my own anxieties about thinking about my mother. So for example, there was a moment one day just talking with a friend, and I said, a friend who knows me really well, and she'd read a draft of the book. And I did talk about how my mother was a really emotional person and her bravery, but also her drinking was very difficult for everyone. And one day I said, when I was a teenager, we lived in the country, and if there was freezing rain or bad weather and I wanted to get, the 10 miles or the 15 miles to high school to be in a rehearsal or to do something, my dad would never drive me and my mother would drive me in any weather. And my friend said, that's not in the book. And I realized, what is this tendency to just look at the bad things? So I remembered my mother's generosity, and that she also had many sides. And, I thought about how we form these narratives about ourselves, about our families, about other people. And it was just a reminder to keep re-examining, looking at the elephant from another side, another place.
You say in the book that your father was your first competition. Why was your father your first competition?
Well, so my dad worked at home, and he would disappear into this little study. And I knew he was a writer, but as a young person, I didn't really know what he was doing for a long time, but I knew that he told stories, and I started to wanted to tell stories. And I don't remember how I got a guitar, but I was 11 or 12 and I got a guitar and I started writing songs. And I was proud of them and I was excited by them. And there's a story where my dad one day comes in and he's all excited because he's discovered Buffy Sainte-Marie, and he thought Buffy Sainte-Marie was just the most amazing. I mean, she is amazing, singer because she wrote from the gut. Now, my idol was Joni Mitchell. So my idol was someone who was very elegant with language and, spun ideas through a melody, through harmonics. And my dad would say, well, that's sort of intellectual stuff. That's not the heart. And so I was so devastated because I thought, oh, I'm all in my head. He's telling me I'm all in my head. And so I guess as a really young writer, that's what I would mean about that. Not that he wasn't always generous, but I don't think he had any idea the effect that had on me. I remember he used to do this all the time. I bet you lots of writers do, especially dramatists. When we would be watching TV, which of course, in the 70s, 60s, we watched a lot of TV. He would sit there and he would always tell us how the plot was going to go, because he'd say, well, then this will happen and this is, well, shut up. Let me discover the plot myself. So I think somewhere inside of me, his mother was a writer too. So I had a few generations of writers. His mother was a woman named Laura Goodman Salverson. And in 1937, the second year the Governor General's Awards were given, she won for fiction. And 2 years later, in 1939, she won for nonfiction for her autobiography. So I think somewhere in the ethos, this young person that was me decided there was a competition. I don't think my dad was competing. I think,
You were competing.
Yeah.
You're a fourth generation writer.
Yeah.
Is being able to write well genetic?
That's a great question. I mean, I think an impulse to writing, probably, right? It's probably this nature-nurture combination of things. I'm thinking about it because I taught playwriting for a number of years at Queen's, and I do work with writers. And I think there are a lot of skills that anybody can learn, but there are impulses, there are tendencies. It might be easier for somebody. So I think it's probably partly genetic, but I would never give up if you didn't find the genetic track, to go down.
Your bio says that you work on atomic culture, which we've talked about, community engaged theater, and this is what I'd like to ask you about, and the place of the foolish witness in social, political, and interpersonal generative relationships.
Yeah.
What the heck is the foolish witness to social, political, and interpersonal generative relationships?
Okay, so when I was a young person, 20s into 30s, I was very involved in social theater, socially engaged theater. I would say that I kind of pursued trauma like a heat-seeking missile. I went for the underbelly of all the stories, and myself and many of my comrades would make these plays about victims, frankly, in my later, analysis of it. Which doesn't mean there's not a place for all that, but I started to get more and more tired of and worried about this way of framing people and their stories. So when I went to graduate school, which I did at OISE at University of Toronto, I was immersed in the kind of the culture of the oppressed and the oppressor, and who was guilty of what, and all sorts of wrongs that need to be addressed, all legitimate. But what it seemed to me I was experiencing was something that I started to call tragic witnessing. So tragic witnessing, which is that I don't see the agency in a person or even in a community. It's like when I first was in Delaunay, the Northwest Territories, which is where the uranium mine was. I went up there looking for cancer and the lies and the secrets from the government to this community. But what I didn't see was the incredible things that young people were doing. I didn't see all the generativity in that community because that's not what I was looking for. So I would call that tragic witnessing. Then the other thing I really saw in graduate school was what I started calling paralyzed witnessing. So paralyzed witnessing would mean I better not say anything because I'm too privileged, I'm too white, I'm too male, I'm too this, I'm too everything. Lots of good questions to ask ourselves, but I felt like it's not helpful to be paralyzed. So foolish witness for me is you're foolish enough to think you might actually be involved in this situation, despite what you don't know, despite your limitations, because you want to try. So I kind of started thinking of it as the willingness to sit down and have a cup of tea, and you might, make a big mess of it, or somebody might reject you, but you're willing to try. And it's so important to me, Brian, because, and look, I'm thinking about the election, and I saw your post about Ukraine the other day, which I was so glad that so grateful for. And there are so many reasons to despair. And I just think if you're foolish enough to be courageous with your heart and think, well, maybe there'll be these things we can't see, I'm not going to give up. It's way too easy. I'm not going to contribute my giving up, my paralysis, and I'm not going to contribute only seeing the anguish, the inevitability of disaster, which is what everyone's talking about in my community right now. And I think I had a great conversation with someone the other day who said, all my friends think this election's going to go to Trump. And I said, but maybe it's not. And I said, I don't want to add to the absolute inevitability because it's like I'll create it or something. I don't want to sound too new agey, whatever, but I think foolish. So long answer to your question. Foolish witness means I'm foolish enough to stay in the game, to show up, to risk somebody saying, I don't want you here, and say, well, maybe somebody else would be willing to have me here in my incompleteness, right? Not waiting till I'm ready enough.
Sounds like you're quoting that Teddy Roosevelt saying about it's better to be in the bloodied in the arena of action than to not to have entered the arena at all. You, I understand, offer resiliency and peer support workshops to communities dealing with trauma. What's that all about?
Yeah. So when in my theater years, because I was working with communities, I learned a kind of a vocabulary for community engagement with theater games and exercises. And some of that vocabulary came from a Brazilian theater director named Augusto Boal, who developed something called Theatre of the Oppressed, which was working initially in Brazil amongst people who spoke many languages. So they were trying to organize in the face of a dictatorship in the countryside, and they couldn't talk. They couldn't talk in Portuguese because people spoke all these indigenous languages. So they figured out a language with theater. So if I was asking you, what is it as a broadcaster? What challenges do you come up with, doing podcasts? What's going on in the media right now? And if you were, say, with 6 or 7 or 10 other people that are also doing podcasts and also dealing with corporate media, and also, you might make an image of a challenge that you have, but you'd make it with your bodies. And then the group would say, well, like, what's one thing we could change in that image that would make it a little bit better for you? So it's a way together of sharing stories, sharing experiences, and it's an analysis of what can happen that could make it better. And so I did that for years, largely with people that are helpers. I love working with first responders. I've worked with the military. I've worked with some cops. Which is funny because for years, as a kind of leftist activist, I was working, with soul support moms. I was working with tenants. I was working with kids on the street. And then, in recent years, I'm working with people that I never knew. I never knew the military, but I live in Kingston, and it's this big military town. And I thought, well, who are the people I don't know here? And what I found out was, if you're a firefighter or an RCMP officer, I've worked with RCMP in Alberta. There's not very many people you can tell about your day. You don't go home and tell your family. So who do you tell? So that, and the reason I call it resilience training, I did a workshop with some first responders in Alberta, and it went really, really well. And the woman who organized it, who was a former RCMP, she said, I could hear them laughing. And she said, I don't really care what else you did in there. They were laughing for like a couple of hours. That's more than enough for me. And the other vocabulary I use in the work is from clown. And clown for me is also about the foolish witness, because clown is this, I'm going to insist that there could be love out there. I'm going to insist that it's absurd to say how beautiful the day is, but it's beautiful. Or it's raining and it's rained for 25 days, but I know that it won't rain tomorrow, because that's just, it's not Pollyanna really. It's a kind of a fierce refusal to give up on beauty. So anyway, the next morning, one of the cops came in and he said, oh, I like that. I would come back to that. And so I said, why? Why? And he said, don't sit in a circle, because I almost didn't come in because you were sitting in a circle, because it looks like a therapy group. So I never sat in a circle again with any of these guys or women. And he said, and don't call it drama, because I won't come to anything called drama. And I went, that's so smart. Of course not. So that's when I started calling it resilience training, because in fact it is. It's about how do we be more resilient. The word is way overused now, but I still think it's a good one. How to have some flexibility, how to take a break, like a pause, and see what other options there are, and how to be in community doing that.
How to take a break, how to take a pause, and how to be in community. Great suggestions for people on how to live a better life. No question. I just spent the last 6 days in the United States traveling to 4 different states and several different cities and speak with people. I got to tell you, everyone there that I met with is worried. The Trump supporters are worried Harris is going to win. The Harris supporters are worried Trump is going to win, and they're all worried about violence post the election. So I think we could use some of your resilience training. We're chatting tonight with Julie Salverson, the author of a book, A Necessary Distance, Confessions of a Scriptwriter's Daughter. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back and maybe hear an excerpt from the book. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Julie Salverson. She is a nonfiction writer, playwright, editor, scholar, and a theater animator. She's a fourth-generation Icelandic-Canadian writer. Her father, George, wrote early CBC radio and television drama, and her grandmother, Laura, won 2 Governor General's Awards in 1937 and 1939. Julie's theater, opera, books, and essays embrace the relationship of imagination and foolish witness to risky stories and traumas. She works on atomic culture, community engaged theater, and the place of the foolish witness in social, political, and interpersonal generative relationships. Salverson offers resilience and peer support workshops to communities dealing with traumas and has many years of experience teaching and running workshops. Recent publications include the book When Words Sing, Seven Canadian Liberate, and Lines of Flight, an atomic memoir. Pretty varied interests. And your book right now is A Necessary Distance, Confessions of a Scriptwriter's Daughter. Fascinating, eclectic collection of interests and works.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I do have a very few interests. It's true. Yeah.
So tell me, when you were reading these books, when did you decide to turn these notebooks of your father's into a new book?
Well, kind of right away. And I think it's because my husband's sort of saying that's your next book, follow that trip, follow that trip. And because I'd already done the atomic story, that one took a long time to figure out what to do with notebooks from those explorations. But this one really quickly. And then the other thing is COVID happened. So it kind of was my COVID deep dive. I spent COVID with my dad, working on the
You
book.
spent COVID with your dad. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And yet his trip was about hunger, but it doesn't sound like your book is about hunger.
When I first started working on it, what I said to myself was, what does hunger look like now? And what does the world need now? Because hunger still exists, obviously. But I felt that in 1963, John F. Kennedy, the American president, announced this was the world they would end hunger. So this film was part of it. And actually, the film, I have the film. It's at the archives in Ottawa. It's 30 minutes. It was narrated by Peter Ustinov, and it played on a Saturday night. It preempted Don Messer's Jubilee for people of my generation that might remember this. So to your question, I kind of asked the question big about what's hunger. What are we hungry for? And I felt like, okay, we're hungry for connection. We're hungry. Maybe we're hungry for the Dalai Lama's, call to be kind. You're talking about your trip just now in the U.S. just before the election, and I'm thinking, hungry for something that isn't just full of fear and full of anger. So that was on my mind as I was working on the book. I was also interested to see what was the situation now in those countries. He was in Indonesia, for example, and I learned about the Jakarta method, which is something that was to do with American and other Western countries' involvement in liberation struggles in developing countries. So I was interested in the evolution of these questions that Dad was exploring. So it's true. It's not about hunger as in food, but it is about hunger as in, I guess the other thing I'd say about the book is, to me, it's very much about what do we do with our inheritance. So my inheritance at one level is my father and the different kinds of sides of who my father was. And my inheritance as a white Canadian, I think it's bigger than the shame of colonization. I feel like all of us, perhaps, and I certainly was trying to do this, are needed at the table. So I feel like hungry for full participation of everybody on the planet right now. So that's kind of maybe a little grand, but it's what I was finding my way through, especially with COVID going on, and the world stopping and maybe taking a breath and asking, what now?
What do you mean about hungry for full participation around the globe?
I think we're so afraid of each other that we're going into little silos of our identities and of our communities, or the places that we feel safe for obvious reasons. There are a lot of reasons to feel unsafe. But so I'll talk about my students. So in my classes at Queen's University, the students are afraid that they won't say the right thing. They're afraid they won't align themselves in the right places. And they're very confused about who they are in a colonial Canada. And I'm talking not only about the white students, but also the students of color who say, look, I don't only want to be seen by my race, or I don't only want to be seen by my gender. And yet they're kind of forced into that. So when I mean everyone bringing the different threads of who we are. I mean, that's what I mean. We need, I think how your experience in the States is maybe the best, right now we're all thinking about this. How do these people who believe really different things or think the only way forward is Harris or Trump, what else can be in the conversation? And how do you have a conversation when there's a fire alarm? It's like the planet has a fire alarm, and none of us think very well when there's a fire alarm. We just want to get out of the building, but we can't get out of the building. So how do we stay in the building? How do we? There's an academic theorist I love, and her name's Donna Haraway. She's American. She talks about staying in the trouble. How do we stay in the trouble? How do we stay in the room together? How do I stay in the room with I have a relative who would be a complete Trump supporter if he was in America, who thinks that everything's corrupt, has no faith and belief in anything, sometimes posts things that horrify me. How do I stay in a compassionate relationship and not, like, I sort of think, how do I not go to Disneyland or buy a gun? And that's what I mean. How do we stay in the trouble together and not hide or shoot each other?
So based on my experience, and it's just a trip that I traveled around several different states and several different cities and talked to numerous different people. Part of it is they're just staying in their echo chamber. They're only listening to, either Fox or CNN. They're only talking to people that think the same as they do.
Did you encounter any exceptions to that?
Not a lot, frankly. I think a lot of people were very worried about what was going to happen because they thought their way was the best and only way, and just couldn't understand why people on the other side of the political divide believed what they believed. And so I think there was this hunger for unity, but only if it was unity their way.
That's such an interesting word, isn't it? Unity, because I think I've often thought unity means, okay, we can relax because, we both want the Blue Jays to win. Okay. But, what about a unity where we learn to be a little bit uncomfortable? And I don't think there are a lot of places we learn to be uncomfortable. My students increasingly come in without knowing that they can be uncomfortable. It doesn't mean something's wrong. It doesn't mean that something's wrong if they don't know the answer to something yet. The echo chamber thing, I think, is so true. And that's a challenge to all of us.
What is it you teach?
I just retired from teaching drama at Queen's University. I teach a lot about what it is to be a witness to violence through the theater, because that's my world. But I'll tell you what I really tried to teach the last few years was how to, what does it mean to think? What does it mean to sit with someone who thinks differently and take your time? I became obsessed with, the beginning of King Lear, while we're in the theater here, the beginning of King Lear decides he's going to give away his land and his property to, he's got 3 daughters. And at the beginning of the play, these 3 daughters are summoned, and he says to them, I'm going to decide who to give what to. So tell me, I wanted to see who loves me the best. Tell me how much you love me. So the first daughter says, I love you as much as the sky and the air and the vast, everything. And he goes, oh, that's good. Daughter number 2. So daughter number 2 says, oh, I love you, the universe. I love you more. I love you, da, da, da. Oh, that's good. Daughter number 3. So daughter number 3 says, I cannot heave my heart into my mouth. Nothing, my lord. So daughter number 3 refuses to speak on demand, refuses to speak in this public moment, And I would talk to my students about this moment because I'd say, which of these three daughters do you think has the most integrity? And the reason I talk about this Cordelia moment is they have to post and like something immediately. They have to agree. They have to be seen to agree. There's no time to say, I don't know yet. So I feel like all I tried to teach increasingly the last few years was take your time. Take your time. Give yourself 5 minutes. And that maybe it takes your whole life to find out what you think about things, that you come to a determination, but then how do you listen to new information? And I think that's like when you talk about the echo chamber, where does the new information come from? I'm such a silly Pollyanna person, and people tease me about it. But when Trump got in 2016, I thought, what would it be to travel across the country? Like what if you had little dinner parties with 6 people, 3 from each camp that were willing to drink together and just listen to who they are? And listen, I think there are nefarious, evil, corrupt people in the world. I'm not talking about everybody here, but I think there are a lot of people that are so scared, so worried, so my relative, I know where my relative gets the news, and it's not somewhere that I would recommend getting the news. It would be great if they read long form journalism from different camps. I mean, I don't think the left listens to anybody either, generally speaking. It drives me crazy. So, what does it mean to not just listen to a soundbite, but, sit across a round table with a bottle of wine and be uncomfortable, and it's ridiculous. I don't know. All I can do, I have a Zen practice. I have a really fabulous Zen teacher, and all she says to me is, to us, she says, do what's in front of you. There'll be always something in front of you. Do what's in front of you and don't add to the shit. Don't add to the mud in the pond. Don't stir it up. Do what's in front of you. I figure, it's tiny and big, right? And when I was an activist, I got completely burned out trying to do everything, everything. And I don't know. I think who did I think I was? I was young. That's right. But yeah.
Well, it might be fun to find out what you were an activist about. But back to your have dinner and wine. I did end up having dinners across the country, and it was primarily the southern United States. And so you can imagine who I was speaking with. But I found some interesting people. I found a lesbian in Florida who had to tell me about LGBT rights in Florida, and the challenge of living in that environment. I sat down with a gentleman in Dallas who was very religious, and he was part of an organization that he described as Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And so it was really quite interesting. The people that I met that were different. I met a gentleman that is convinced there's civil war coming and said that the reason why the Second Amendment is there was to protect ourselves from the election that's going to be stolen this week. And he's got rounds of ammunition in his basement. Every single one of the conspiracy theories that we think are conspiracy theories, he is convinced are not conspiracy theories. They're the truth. So, fascinating people to meet. We got to take a break for some messages. When we come back, we're going to ask Julie to read something from her book. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes.
Yep.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Julie Salverson. She's an author that's written a really interesting book called A Necessary Distance, Confessions of a Script Writer's Daughter. Julie, I wonder, could you read something from your book, please?
Okay, sure. So this is from the opening. The first thing I remember of my father's trip around the world is mashed peas. Shortly after returning home, he fell ill. There were mysterious conversations in the hallway outside my parents' room and an unprecedented home visit by Dr. Vale, our family doctor. Dad had contracted hepatitis in Jakarta. He was sentenced to bed rest and a diet of peas, which I would prepare by mixing the canned vegetables into a gray medicine. This all seemed very glamorous, the abrupt departure 3 months before, the colorful postcards with exotic stamps, now this mysterious illness. Nobody in our family and nobody we spoke to during that time had even heard of Jakarta. If you think about it, the trip was an iconic colonial enterprise. A group of white men from the first world fly to the third with padded seats and per diems to make a documentary about world hunger, to find out what's wrong over there. I suspect there was pretty much a complete lack of self-criticism about the level of consumption back home, but I might be wrong because I haven't read my father's journals yet. Now, in 2014, his battered black-covered notebooks pulse in the corner of my study. I can't bring myself to read past the beginning and a few sporadic pages, glimpses of the trip. The cultural moment in which I open these pages is a murky surface that separates me from the water in which he swam. What is a first impression? An unexamined look before analysis. The brain is hasty. In a split second, it recognizes and files away information that shocks or calms, provokes or reassures. First responses. The books vibrate with energy, movement. The man is present. He is private, careful about the level of sharing with his colleagues. It's only with his notebooks that he shares his increasing discomfort as his perceptions of his fellow humans change. These are not the notes he would have been making about the script. What are my responsibilities to his privacy? Does blood lineage allow me a certain permission? The notebooks feel like an inheritance, an imperative, one that must be honored. And I'm not looking back, tracing my ancestry. That has never interested me. The direction is different. The notebooks reach forward and make a claim. Do I seal them away, preserve them, or do I break them open, seed them into a story? It's already too late. I am a witness now.
Why do you think he wrote and saved the notebooks if they were so personal about a trip that he took? And you say it's not about the actual story; it was about his reactions to what was going on.
Well, that's the question, because he, as you said earlier, he wrote over 1,000 scripts and he didn't keep much of anything. And in fact, he didn't keep much of anything in his life. 5 or 6 boxes were left. And he kept them. And they moved a lot. My parents moved a lot. And he's a writer. So maybe he didn't think nobody would read them. I mean, maybe not as he was writing them, but maybe later. And he knew I was a writer and he knew I was interested in things. So maybe it was just the way we are with something that so connects us to a part of our own lives that we don't want to put it down or throw it away. Maybe maybe that's all it was, which is not nothing. But I have started to think writers always want someone to read what they write. So maybe there was some idea of a future that he had. I have no idea. People have also asked me, how did the trip change him? I don't know. I have no evidence of anything. It would be speculation. But maybe it was the only time he left North America, that trip. So maybe he held on to that part of his own life where he was courageous. I mean, when you were talking about the silos in America, and Dad got out of his silo. He got in little planes. While they were on the trip, there were 3 Canadian filmmakers were killed flying into a mountain doing a documentary. They knew the guys. So this was not always the safest thing to be doing. And he was willing to step out of his safety zone. So maybe he wanted to remember that about himself. Maybe.
You don't think he knew you were going to find them?
Well, when you put it that way, it seems like, yeah, I guess so.
No, I really wonder.
Yeah.
Whether people want to be known,
Yeah.
and heard. I'll give you two examples. I'm not sure whether this is. I'll give you the 2 examples, and I'll let you interpret it. So my mother recently passed away. I think probably 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, I gave her one of these little books that you may have seen that ask your mother a series of questions and asked them to write the answers to these questions about, my recollection of when she was born, her childhood, her marriage, when I was born, a whole bunch of things. And I forgot that I gave it to her. And 2 or 3 months, Thanksgiving, before she passed away, she gave me the book, all written out, with answers to these questions. And it's almost a nonfiction book, in the length of it. And she gave me a bunch of pictures, that was of her and of the family and things like this. And she was healthy at the time. 3 months later, she passed away, or 2.5 months later, she passed away. So it was almost as if she was, in my mind, anticipating her death, and getting ready for it, and making sure that the things that she wanted me to get, other people to get, she took care of. And the stories in the book
Hmm.
are not all, but a lot of them are stories I hadn't heard before, things I hadn't heard before, challenges that she and my father had, that in life, that I didn't know. At least I didn't know in the detail that she described them in the book. And I wondered why I never heard some of these stories when I was alive. Another instance, if I could, I ended up having a whole series of dinners over the course of about 2 years with another lady who's passed away recently, and she would tell me stories about her life that even her daughter didn't know about, and she would sit down at dinners. And as her daughter was in a different room, she would tell me a story. And then when her daughter would come in the room, she'd clam up. It was as if she wanted someone to know, but she didn't want her daughter to know, or at least daughter to know while she was alive, even though she probably knew that I was going to tell her daughter. So I wondered if people really want to be known after they pass.
You know, first of all, thank you for that. That's what a great thing to have. And I kind of want to thank you, because I think you've helped me see that yeah, that it is a gift that he gave me. Yeah, I think, of course, we all want to be seen. I think that's so huge and so fundamental. And yeah, I mean, he knew that he wasn't throwing them out, right? So that's going to help me a little bit, Brian, with the nervousness of putting him out in the world through my framework, my curation. And it's I read the proofs just about a week ago, and it was a really emotional thing for me, because you haven't read something since you kind of worked your way through it. I mean, I've read drafts, but not for ages. And I thought, I hope this is okay, Dad. But I think you're right. I think you're right. I think things don't really happen accidentally. And I don't think me finding them was an accident either. I said it was an accident at the beginning of our conversation, but it wasn't. It wasn't. So yeah, and I've done my best to be respectful, but also candid with how I've done it. And I listened to an interview, I think it was Wynton Marsalis, talking about his father, and he was so full of love for his father, and it made me realize how I was so full of nervous judgment as I was, working with my dad's notebooks. I thought, who do you think you are that you have this framework to look at these guys in 1963? Look what they were doing. It was amazing what they were doing. And that's got me, that's really brought me back to this thing of what we need. We need all of our inheritance, so that we don't only have, judgments that dismiss, because people are all capable of so many things. And my dad tried. He got out of his echo chamber and got on a plane that, wasn't a very safe plane, many planes. So yeah, I think he wanted to be, I'm really proud of it, really. I'm happy to have him be seen, and my grandmother too, because yeah, thanks. Thanks. And maybe you'll do something with your mother's book.
Maybe I will. Maybe I should. Maybe she wants me to. Julie,
Yeah.
Salverson, thank you so much for joining us. Remind us the name of the book and where we can get it.
The name of the book is A Necessary Distance, Confessions of a Scriptwriter's Daughter. My grandmother's book was Confessions of an Immigrant's Daughter. That's why that. It'll be available just about everywhere. And I'm going to be doing, on my website, you can see readings and things that I'm doing. So yeah, Wall Second Win is the fantastic publisher. Noel Allen is the publisher there that I've worked with, and they are amazing. Hamilton Press, small Canadian press. And if you want it, order it from a local independent bookstore, but it would be also, or get it at your library. Or thank you very much for having me.
Julie, thank you for joining us. And I guess in addition to potentially reading your book, buying your book, if there's a message of this conversation, I think it would be to try to memorialize something about your parents or your grandparents. I've interviewed a couple of people in their latter years, and they're some of the best interviews because people really, I think, do get perspective of their life and do want to memorialize it, whether in writing or in audio or video. And so I think that's a wonderful inheritance that people can pass down. Julie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Kingston, Ontario at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos go up on podcast servers and social media and a YouTube channel. My website, briancrombie.com, as soon as the radio show goes to air. Thanks for joining. Good night, everybody. Thank you, Julie.